You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine. Yo, we're talking about Norwegian black metal today. So we have the usual crew. We got the Shelly from the HateMeditations.com. Welcome, Shelly.
Hello, it's good to be back. It's been a while.
Yes, sir. It's great to have you back. I know a lot of responsibilities, and you are dialing back the content on HateMeditations.com due to the parenthood and all that, which is completely understandable. And you're still cranking out articles more than a lot of other people do. So definitely great to have you on today. We also have Tyler rejoining. Thank you, Tyler.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be back.
Yep, and got that Rafael, the Portuguese psychologist. Welcome, Rafael.
Thank you a lot for bringing me back again.
Yes, sir. And we also have Roman from Cromlech, which I think they rebranded as a different name, right, Roman?
Yeah. Hey, Hales, thanks for having me back on, guys. Baron left the band about a month ago, and we reformed under the name Mormagil, but essentially the same band minus Baron.
And Baron was the other muscly guy?
Yeah.
So you guys are losing some muscles now.
Yeah, we gotta find another bald power lifter to play guitar.
Yep, get some more cue balls. But today we're talking about Norwegian black metal general topic today, and we're chatting a little bit before the episode, and we believe that we should not go into the fucking history of Norwegian black metal. So many books have been written on it, so many documentaries and all that. So we beating a dead bush and bore you to death by saying, oh yeah, these guys are fucking murderers and arsonists and all that. But it just kind of
Hollywood stuff by now.
Just kind of goes into how monomaniacal they were about the expression they had and how much they were in it. So I'm just going to have like a general roundtable discussion today about Norwegian black metal, what makes it special, what really makes it stand out, beyond the controversies, from a artistic expression point of view. Shelly, what particularly stands out to you the most about Norwegian black metal?
It's both the best and worst thing to happen to black metal. The best because arguably some of the finest works came out of the Norwegian scene. The worst because it now defines what black metal means to most people, even people that are kind of steeped in the world of black metal. Because at the time, black metal was still kind of coming into form. You had, through the late 80s, you had bands like Bathory and Celtic Frost and Sarcophago beginning to kind of do something that was distinct enough from death metal and thrash to warrant kind of more scrutiny. And then you had sort of other European bands. You had like the Greek scene taking shape with Rotting Christ and Barathron and Necromantia. You had bands in Central Europe like Roots and Master's Hammer and Tormentor, and they were all grasping at this. Oh, and of course you had America as well with bands like Von and Profanatica kind of doing their thing. All very distinct, all very different styles, but all kind of grasping at a form of extreme metal that was very distinct from death metal and thrash and grindcore, although there was crossover. Norway, and we've discussed this on the episode on Mayhem, sort of administrated by Euronymous, who was very good at marshalling all of these individuals, inspiring them and kind of creating almost this doctrine of what he understood black metal could and should be. And all of the original bands that form that scene, your Burzum, Immortal, Dark Throne, Mayhem, Emperor, they're all very distinct themselves, but they all bear similarities that made them distinctively Norwegian, talking about the frigid atmospheres, the trebly guitars, the centering of the tremolo picking, the blast beats. All of that is very distinct from the kind of heavy metal influence thing that the Greeks were doing, or the kind of dark grindcore that the Finnish bands were doing. And it's, again, very distinct from what was going on in Eastern Europe. But in the minds of like the populace now, the populace that's interested in black metal, Norway is black metal. It defines what it is now, and that sound that is on the early Mayhem work and early Dark Throne work is the definition of black metal. And for me, it's quite frustrating, because although I love these albums and I love this work, some of my favorite albums came out of this scene. It's frustrating that it has also come, through no fault of the artists themselves, it's come to define what black metal is, and it's quite limiting in that way. I think Norway needs to be sort of resituated as a distinct and unique scene within a much broader international movement that was going on at the time, and continue to go on through to the late 90s, even after the Norwegian scene burnt itself out through the crimes of various individuals. So I think that's where that's my take, if we want to use that annoying phrase. That's where I kind of situate Norwegian black metal, and then from there you can kind of go into the specifics of what each individual artist was doing, why it was distinct from their scene mates, but also why it was distinctively Norwegian as opposed to USBM or Greek or Finnish and Swedish as well, I should mention as well.
Well, there's a interesting band from Norway that gets overlooked a lot, not part of one of the Norwegian greats, but still has a lot of relevance. And that is Ildjarn, and Nidhogg, the offshoot, with his buddy, I forget the guy's real name, but with Sorkvakter and Ildjarn and Nidhogg, there was a lot of experimentation going on there, especially like stripping black metal down to its rawest essences, like most primitive and basic form, and just having sheer fucking hatred, just being expressed. What's your view about Ildjarn and placing them within the black metal canon? Granted, your blog is called Hate Meditations, which is one of the tracks off of Strength and Anchor from Ildjarn. So you might have some thoughts on Ildjarn that might be cool to express before we bring in Tyler and the others.
Yeah, so actually one of the reasons I named the blog Hate Meditations after the track on Strength and Anger is it sort of sums up the ethos of Ildjarn, which is incredibly obsessive, incredibly single-minded, and incredibly self-limiting. And it's almost like this monotonous rumination on the same limited set of ideas. And the reason it's fascinating for me is it's kind of like it boils down the philosophy of Dark Throne around Transylvania Hunger down to its most basic components. It says that the mid-pace blast beats, the tremolo picking, and the cold atmospheres, but strip any kind of catchiness, any melody, any pleasantness from it. Just strip it back to its most basic components, and then build it up again. And in a slightly different phase of my blog, I wrote an essay on this, and I kind of likened it to Descartes' Meditations, in that his method was to boil everything, all suppositions, all knowledge away, and leave only the most obvious, sort of the most basic statement that you can make, and that's where he gets the cogito from. And Ildjarn does a similar thing in that his music isn't just about destruction. It strips everything away, but in order to build something new on that. And there are kind of moments of revelation throughout Ildjarn's work. There's just the simplest key change or the simplest addition of a melody, sandwiched within like endless like chunks of noise. And suddenly they become revelatory, because he's done all this work to basically chip away at any kind of pleasantness. And I find that really fascinating as like the logical conclusion of what black metal was doing at the time. And you're right to call it experimental, because most people dismiss it as saying there's nothing to love about this music. There's none of the beautiful melodies that Burzum and Emperor were writing. There's no kind of interesting atmosphere. The Ildjarn recordings are not just lo-fi, they're very, very unpleasant. They're like listening to a band practicing from 3 doors down, and you're just getting all of this distortion and background noise. So there's very little to love in it, but it is a process of experimentation to see where this kind of abrasive, hateful, minimalist project will take you. And I think throughout Ildjarn's work, and particularly with his work with Nidhogg, there are some really revelatory moments that kind of capture the essence of what black metal could have or should have been about. But again, unfortunately, because it's deeply inaccessible music, it was largely derided even by champions of black metal.
Yeah, just to kind of chime in on how experimental it was, especially delving into the Sort Voctor stuff, which I think was Iljarn guy and some other people. They're playing different instruments on each track. Like one guy will play guitar on one track, bass, and then drums and scream on the next, and it's all over the place. They're really it's like shifting around all the members to different instruments to see if they can, get different types of expression out by just passing the instruments to your neighbor and all that. So there's definitely the experimental side to it, and especially with the ambient albums, really interesting. Here you have this band that's all very dissonant, primitive, most basic in a sense, and then you have this expansive lush atmosphere come out on the ambient albums. How would you rationalize that? I mean, being that there's actually pleasant and nice and some could say beautiful textures in the ambient albums, how would you place that with the rest of the Iljarn discography, Shelley?
Well, I think it all comes down to Nidhogg at this point. So the ambient album that Iljan did on his own, Landscapes, is a double album, and it matches his metal work for minimalism. And again, it's not highly rated within the scene because it is so minimal. It's basically just drone music in a way. And I still find it incredibly meditative and profound because it follows the same philosophy of his metalwork in that it is again a process of stripping everything back to the very fundamentals and then sort of rebuilding on top of that foundation. But the ambient album he made with Nidhogg is kind of almost an alter ego where you take the austere philosophy of Iljan, but Nidhogg was much more interested in building melodic statements as well. And I think he was able to kind of temper Iljan's very single-minded, very monomaniacal approach to composition. And the kind of synthesis of these two minds does create something profoundly beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful kind of ambient albums to come out of the black metal circle because of that. And you also have this deep connection to nature. It's a concept album based on basically a single day from sunrise to nightfall, and it's very organically shaped in that way, and it really gets across this feeling of being completely alone in a natural wilderness somewhere, far more than other albums from sort of later artists who claim to be inspired by the natural world. This comes across much more as like a form of naturalist program music almost, and it does this far more successfully than a lot of contemporary bands that claim the same influence.
Yeah, and well, of course, Strauss did that too, with his symphony. An Alpine symphony is what it's called. Each movement is a different part of the day as he's, climbing a mountain. But Hardanger Vida, I think that's how you pronounce it.
Something like that, yeah.
There's a Norwegian composer, Geir Tveit, I think it's how you pronounce it. Most of his works were lost in a fire, but he went across the Norwegian countryside and he went and transcribed a lot of folk melodies he encountered and orchestrated them essentially. And there's a lot of pieces that he has about Hardanger, or I think that's how you pronounce it, around there, that it's dedicated to that part of nature in Norway. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that the ambient album from the Iljarn Nidhogg is really rooted in deep Norwegian culture. Tyler, any thoughts on that Iljarn and general Norwegian black metal?
Sure. So when it comes to Norwegian black metal, my thoughts largely align with Shelley. I would say that the disappointing thing about Norwegian black metal becoming the sort of template for all black metal after is that what made Norwegian black metal interesting was its sense of a reviewer I read once described it as wildcat genius. That it was not just the elements that most people identify as attractive about the genre, like the flowing sense of melody, which really is something kind of, especially in the tremolo picking, inherited from death metal to a certain degree, just played in higher tunings than most later death metal used. And the extreme blast beats, something that's always been kind of an annoyance of mine, that black metal kind of got reduced to something where people would identify by purely superficial aspects, like, oh, black metal is just more extreme than death metal, so it has faster blast beats and faster tempos because it's more extreme. But more than that, it was how weird it could be. Black metal had more of a sense in some ways of theatricism to its song structures and to its riffing techniques, where it would do things that were unexpected, but in the course of the development of a piece would make sense and lead to some truly profound moments. And when when Norwegian black metal became a template, that kind of defied that that impulse within what made Norwegian black metal great. It went against the idea that what made it awesome was that it was exploring a frontier. It was doing something that was exciting, and it's not necessarily that it was doing something that was new. A kind of drive that honestly can ruin a lot of music and somewhat, I suppose, counterintuitively make it predictable. It was that it would not be afraid to do something because it strayed outside of the sort of consensually understood definitions of what makes heavy metal or extreme metal what it is. And at a much more deeper level, and this relates to Ildjarn, what the best of black metal did and what Ildjarn did was obtain a sort of mastery of the sculpture of raw emotion. Ildjarn, by reducing black metal, by stripping it down to almost a just total flow of raw, you can even say on the black metal albums, ambient melody, basically took music to its most fundamental element, which is just how the movement or shift of the melody affects the emotion of the listener. And in doing so, was able to train itself to be able to master the art of like communicating what exactly it was they were trying to through the music. It was kind of almost an attempt to make a purely abstract form of expression rather than relying on some more forms of symbolism that popular music relied upon, like lyrical subject matter or the the sensual experience of certain rhythmic devices or harmonies or vocal timbre. So Ildjarn, I feel, is one of the most excellent examples of that. And I think it's interesting that Ildjarn had a foray into actual electronic ambient music because I feel that the impetus behind both the ambient music and the black metal material from Ildjarn is fairly similar, as different as they can sound aesthetically, because they both are kind of relying on that same mechanic, that idea of just simply reducing music to the raw sculpture of tone and how that impacts the listener. And I think that's something that you can also find in other great Norwegian black metal artists, like Burzum, for instance, or Darkthrone. I honestly feel in some ways Ildjarn kind of was carrying on the legacy of those bands, and even carrying on a legacy that those bands were picking up from uh, earlier kind experiments of that nature that set the foundation for black metal, like Hellhammer and Bathory. In some ways, I feel you could say that Iljarn walks heir to the throne of Hellhammer, Bathory, and Burzum.
I unsure if I agree, heir to the throne with the Iljarn. I think Iljarn's like a rejection of the throne. I understand, there's a lot of spirit, behind the music that's being conveyed, but still, I think deep down it is like a very pronounced nihilistic statement, and it's one that rejects everything. So, Raphael, what's your thoughts on that Iljarn?
Well, I think Shelley already gave a very good description of what Iljarn amounts to, both in terms of music and, ideology, if you could call that. Well, for my part, I think I probably like the concept of Iljarn more than the music itself. It's not that I dislike the music. I like Iljarn, I can say that. It's just that I feel that at some point it doesn't really... just purely on the musical weight, it doesn't really. It's not as pleasant as you probably could hope for, although that's obviously part of it. But yes, I think overall, I think it's very fair to say that Iljarn is probably, in all of black metal, even outside of Norwegian black metal, it's probably the furthest that the genre went into. But basically, its logical conclusion, as Shelley said. And regarding the lack of atmosphere, I would add that ironically, I think that Iljarn has a sort of an atmosphere. Strangely enough, I do feel a certain that type of nature worshipping, just purely not in a contemplative way, as in Burzum, for example, but in a purely irrational, feral way. So not more of a beastly way of belonging to nature, basically. And I also agree with what Tyler said regarding the facility with the electronic music, because the method and the mechanic is relatively similar. I think that's why, even though there was obviously a very important contribution from Nidog, I think that's why it was easy for them to also produce some very, very good ambient music. I would also agree that Ardangar Vida is probably the best album, in my opinion, the best ambient album that the scene has produced. Yes, I think that's my thoughts basically on Iljarn.
Awesome. So we got Roman next for his input. Roman, I know a lot has already been said about Iljarn, so how would you kind of place them, in the Norwegian black metal scene beyond what's already been said? Do you echo all the sentiments that have been said, or do you have other things you want to chime in on?
Well, basically, it's difficult to follow up after so many great in-depth analysis and insights right here. So I'll just kind of say what I think about the whole thing. Iljarn to me has always been a classic example of what I think about minimalistic composition. And so I definitely don't write that way myself. I'm much more of a maximalist when it comes to songwriting, but I always talk about how people can reject minimalism because it seems primitive or unrefined, or it's not technical or whatever. But there really is a beauty and an art to doing more with less. And Iljarn is a classic example of this right here. It is, as many have said, kind of taking elements of Norwegian black metal and taking them to their logical conclusion. The band that I always compare Iljarn to compositionally the most is Discharge, because in a lot of ways they do the same thing, which is 2 riffs per song, and they somehow managed to make that work. And that's an achievement. And the thing is with minimalism that, when you're limiting the elements that you can use, the introduction of new elements of changes into the songs, as Shelley was kind of pointing out earlier, that really those changes become more pronounced and more profound than they would in, say, a song where you got like 20-30 riffs and you can't really tell the parts distinctly apart from one another. I would say that Iljarn takes that to its logical conclusion on Strength and Anger, because I believe, I can never remember whether it's Strength and Anger 10 or Strength and Anger 15, which is just literally just a blast beat and a chord all the way through. And that's it. It's literally just one chord. And it would be strange and counterintuitive and baffling for anybody to release that as a standalone thing, but in the context of the album, it works. That's one of those, that's definitely an album you have to listen to as an album, as a unit, or otherwise like a song like that doesn't make any sense. Now, when we're speaking about black metal, generally speaking, in Norwegian black metal and the template issue, the fact of the matter is, with all music and definitely with metal, we see the progression over time of somebody coming up with a new idea, or going to a frontier, as Tyler was saying, and they explore that frontier, and there's this flowering of creativity and artistic development at the beginning, and then eventually kind of solidifies into a form and a template. People start using that template, and eventually people move on to something else. You can see that development through like thrash metal, death metal, and black metal. Thrash metal goes on, and it does, as Fenris would talk about this, how it's like late 80s, it's all about the thrash riffarama, the tech thrash stuff, or techno thrash as they all used to call that kind of stuff back then. And that goes, people reject that, go into death metal because they want something with a little bit more of a darker atmosphere. And then eventually, like death metal, Fenris is already like death metal is a template, and this mainstream thing by 1990, which is remarkably far-sighted when you think about it, but I guess people in the scene have their ear to the ground more to that kind of stuff. And then you get to 1994, by the time that a lot of these foundational black metal albums have been released, and according to some people, well, that's where it ends right there. That's where it became a template. So anyways, in describing that, I'm just trying to point out that I think with all genres, even when they try to defy templates and defy conventional ways of doing things, those conventions arise, and it would be odd to make music entirely based off just previously rejecting the previous template, but that is what black metal somewhat did with death metal. Regardless, I know that I don't think the position of Norwegian black metal right now is quite as solidified as being the main expression of the genre as it once used to be. At least I can say, like, growing up in the Toronto black metal scene, there was a very conscious rejection of Norway as being the only expression of black metal. People over here were listening a lot more to war metal, to Root, Master's Hammer, the Greek stuff, Necromass, from Italy.
Is blasphemy considered black metal?
Objectively or subjectively?
I mean, generally.
I would consider. I mean, well,
Paul Lidney, we're talking about templates in Norway, right?
Yeah.
How a lot of the mechanisms that were used in creating that Norwegian black metal sound has just been copied to death. And there is a basic template essentially for 1,000 Darkthrone clones. But you ask Paul Lidney what black metal is, and he will flat out say it is the embodiment of evil. It should be satanic, and it doesn't really conform to the mechanisms that is just displayed in that Norwegian sound. It's more about the message and the spirit behind it being one that is evil, satanic, anti-Christian, all that. That's what makes black metal, which could have the surface level, musically speaking, of death metal riffs. Like, he loves Necropolis, and most people will say like Necropolis is like a proto death metal band, but he looks at them as black metal because the spirit behind them is what he has in Profanatica, and Profanatica itself is very anti-religious and a lot of obscene imagery. So that defies the Norwegian template, and I was kind of curious, like, what the Canadian template would be, because you have the blasphemy, you have the conqueror, you have the revenge, you have Axis of Advance. Axis of Advance could be considered black metal. Am I correct?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question we've just opened up right there, because I think we're getting into more nuanced discussions of ideology and aesthetics, and also of presentation versus the music itself. And that's, that you can open a whole can of worms by getting into that. I will, I'll address those things one at a time. First thing I'll say is that when we're talking about the death metal, black metal distinction, I mean, of course, that black metal was created as a conscious rejection of the death metal template, there were always bands within there that it was more acceptable for them to like. For example, Deicide and Morbid Angel. Now, Deicide, and I suspect part of this actually has to do somewhat with what you're talking about right there, the very obvious satanic evil aspect of what they're doing. But on a musical level, I've said this time and time again. It's unthinkable to think of a band like Immortal, for example, without thinking of Altars of Madness. And I'm not even talking about Blizzard Beasts later on. I think that if you go to Battles in the North, if you go to Pure Holocaust, a lot of those riffs could have been on Altars of Madness, or there are riffs from Altars of Madness that could have been on those albums. These very fast warping riffs that go underneath go over top the blast beats. So the musical, I think it's like this. It's like with a lot of definitions of things. Definitions of things are very are useful when there's clear and obvious distinctions, but always it's kind of like a color palette. One color bleeds into the other, and there's a crossover going on there. When we talk about blasphemy, blasphemy is basically, well, they're basically the same as Beharit right there, which is on a to put it a little simply, a fusion between black metal and grindcore, or at least black metal song construction using technique from grindcore and to a certain extent death metal. Is that still black?
I know for Beharit, Sarcophago was like the main influence.
Yes, exactly. And Sarcophago is also coming out of this very like punk 80s kind of attitude about doing things, but also very, consequently very grindy. But Beharit was definitely influenced by blasphemy as well. And yeah, essentially, like, we're looking at all this stuff. Yeah, you're gonna have variations on technique and things that defy the template immediately. If we're going to talk about Canadian sound, obviously the bands that everybody's going to point to are initially, like you said, Blasphemy, Conquer, Revenge, which are essentially, for lack of a better term, war metal, black metal using grindcore and death metal technique. You get to Axis of Advance and Sacramentary Abolishment. There's absolutely tons of black metal over that, but that's more of a conscious, just hybrid fusion of the two genres at that point.
Why isn't it just Canadian black metal then? Since they all kind of have the similar aesthetics, essentially, like the blasphemy aesthetic. And I know early Axis of Advance is very black metal-y in the Norwegian sense, like there's a lot of tremolo riffing and all that, but why isn't just considered just Canadian black metal? Why do we have to attribute war metal to that? Where that is like the black metal expression of Canada, like and black metal being an ambiguous descriptor.
Yeah, that's a fair term. That's a fair term. That's a fair way of putting it, rather. I would, again, when we're talking about Conqueror and Blasphemy, particularly, I think that the flow of their songs is definitely more black metal. I would definitely say that's you can say Canadian black metal for sure. I think that the desire to frame things as war metal again comes out of maybe what Shelley was pointing to earlier, which is the understanding in most people's minds that like the Norwegian sound, or to a lesser extent the Swedish sound too, which I think not that the Swedish bands were foundational, but essentially they all worked off the De Mysteriis Dom Satanas Transylvanian Hunger template right there. That this is what most people understand to be black metal. So if people feel that there needs to be a distinction with another term right there, war metal. But yeah, Canadian black metal would definitely, absolutely be accurate for Blasphemy and Conqueror right there. The thing is with Acts of Advance, I feel that's a little bit of a different beast right there, because the song construction is different. It's less, for lack of a better word, it's less ambient. It takes the song constructions there are more labyrinthian and take more from death metal. If you look at the, I guess I'm also thinking Sacramental Abolishment here too, because fundamentally pretty similar band or almost the same band on a certain level. You look at the first Sacramental Abolishment album, River of Corticone, and at least aesthetically, there's a very conscious effort to imitate brutal death metal, not on a riff level because it's more diatonic than chromatic, but definitely on an aesthetic level. And they got the whole Funeral Doom thing going on there. I think it would be interesting to go back and look at the interviews and see if they'd consider themselves as black metal as such. They probably would. And again, they would probably attribute that to a certain spirit to the music as well. I just think
that's what I was trying to get at. Sorry,
Yeah.
we've gone way more in depth on Canadian black metal than this Norwegian black metal warrants.
Yeah.
This episode warrants. But what I was trying to get at is, there's that Norwegian black metal template that you were talking about. Why isn't there the Canadian black metal template with the bands, I just labeled as Canadian black metal and whatnot? But I think everyone, especially the media, I think the media is probably the biggest culprit here.
Well, yeah, sorry to chime in, but I was going to say, I think the reason there should be, based on this discussion, Canadian black metal, and here's roughly how it's defined. But I think, and sorry for anyone that's heard me bang on about this before, because I've got a bee in my bonnet about it, a bunch of people in the US, obviously, many fine black metal bands have come out of the US, but a bunch of post-metal or indie artists, shoegaze artists, decided that they liked the aesthetic of Norwegian black metal, the guitar tone and the strumming and the atmospheres, and applied it to their own form of sort of experimental post-rock, post-indie, and it became known as like black gaze or post-black metal or the next step in the evolution. And you get lots of champions for this in the media because it looks pretty and it takes something that is considered ugly and dangerous and domesticates it. And I think in the process, a side effect of that is the unique angle of a scene like Canada or a scene like Southern Europe. Again, I mentioned like Varafron, Early Rotting Christ, Necromantia, Zamael. They get kind of left out of the equation to some extent because this new explosion is saying, no, we're explicitly taking influence from Burzum and Darkthrone and we're applying it to this new form of music, when really they're not. They're taking influence only insofar as they take the vibe from it. And that begins to frame people's understanding of what black metal is. And these other unique interpretations kind of get left out in the cold. But as has already been pointed out, like these definitions, they are useful. And, as a music critic, I need this terminology in order to communicate where a piece of music sits and to contextualize it is essential. But when they begin to sort of limit or confound the picture a bit, that's when you need to sort of step back and just accept that there is an imprecision there. Like, we mentioned the Swedish scene, Sacramentum, Dissection, they kind of sit on the fault line. Sometimes they play a riff that's death metal, sometimes a heavy metal riff, sometimes a black metal riff. They kind of toy with the border a little bit, and you kind of just have to accept that it's going to have that level of imprecision. But the fact that the Norwegian style, as it became normalized by about 1994, 95, has just come to define, most people's understanding of black metal. And I think just to also add, I think what can be really constructive here is bringing it back to Norway to look at some of the bands that didn't quite get it. So I'm thinking of the Satyricons, the early Dimmu Borgir, to some extent enslaved from about Frost onwards. I like Frost. I think it's a fine album, but it starts to show the cracks or the limits of the individuals involved in Enslaved. And, Satyricons, Dark Medieval Times, the Shadow Throne, they look like black metal albums, or they look like, rebuttals to early Emperor and so on. But in fact, they're kind of toying with chunks of the music, but they're not really capable of constructing a statement in the same way Varg was, or Fenris was for a time, and yeah, they're not quite getting it. And you could see the same with Dimmu Borgir as well, with their first two albums. They're quality black metal albums. I still think there's quality in early Dimmu Borgir, but there is still this sort of sense that they're creating, they're sort of speaking it in a second language almost. They're not quite as connected to the form that the foundational acts were tapping into. And I think that can be incredibly constructive to look at that and then say, well, what are these albums missing that the canonized classics had? And comparing and contrasting them can be really informative in that way.
I have a question for the table regarding that. So the history of heavy metal, you see a constant desire to resist normalization through concentrically increasing degrees of extremity. You saw that, as Roman pointed out, with thrash metal as compared to traditional heavy metal or new wave of British heavy metal, death metal with thrash metal, black metal with death metal. So you kind of have this same cultural phenomenon happening here with black metal, right? That it became as I pointed out earlier, a template, and Shelley pointed out pretty much all the history of that template's abuse, from the Dimmu Borgirs and Satyricons to Cradle of Filth on up to more recent times with black gaze and post black metal. And talking about Canadian black metal in relation to that, it's somewhat, I think, the reason why it's not thought of as black metal even by its own adherents is it's a reactionary impulse, almost that same impulse there. We don't necessarily want to fully outright own the term black metal because of what it's associated with. But my question would be, why did the reactionary impulse in scenes like Canada or other scenes that obviously took great inspiration from the entire history of black metal, not just Norway? You could maybe say the Greek scene or the Eastern or the Central European scene. Why did that impulse in those scenes not lead to like another flowering of extreme metal expression the way that thrash metal did with traditional heavy metal or death metal with thrash metal? Why did they kind of just become their own isolated niche groups that in some ways kind of, I don't know if this is the right term, petered out over time rather than develop further the way those other expressions like thrash metal or death metal or black metal did? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
You mean why was there not why is black metal the last extreme metal subgenre? Is that the framing of
pretty much, yeah. Like, why was it the last major development when it was reacting on that impulse, increasing the extremity in response to the normalization of death metal? Whereas war metal was also kind of trying to increase the extremity in response to the normalization of black metal, but didn't have a similar result, in my opinion.
It's a good question. I mean, the lazy answer is black metal just seems like the logical conclusion of the evolution of heavy guitar music since, even the late 60s or whatever. Not just in terms of the music itself, in that it's so obviously a statement that is trying to be deeply unpleasant and misanthropic and so on, but also, the individual acts of the members of the Norwegian scene. It's the Greek tragedy all over again, and the kind of the media's and the fans' obsession with the murders and the arsons and the suicides and so on. That kind of brought the theatric evil of metal into sort of stark relief. And it's kind of like, the question is, how do you top that? How do you go further than that? But also, like, to some extent, it feels like black metal has, it never met with a rebuttal. It just incrementally evolved. But yeah, as I said, I can't.
It was met with a rebuttal. Two Norwegian bands that tried to rebut what happened, and up to 1994 was that Mysticum and Thorns, by incorporating industrial elements into their black metal sound. So they did try to, continue on with black metal with reshaping it into something else. But yeah, it never gained like substantial footing. It never broke that template that everyone else was latching onto. But there were attempts to get outside of that template to create different types of expression that is technically, within the Norwegian black metal sound, but incorporating, more electronic elements and things of that nature. So there were attempts, it just never gained footing.
And I think that's why a lot of the artists kind of escaped into ambient or electronic or non-metal forms, because they kind of black metal, more than any other form of music, form of metal music, tends to burn people out. They only manage a handful of albums before, you can't reach that level of intensity over a sustained career, which is why I think a lot of them escaped into ambience, because they kind of realized that, that the statement had been made, and you couldn't continue to make that statement without reformulating the question. And that question was, let's remove the rock legacy from this and see what remains. And that's why you get the the Iljans and the Burzums and the Behirits and so on. Going into sort of the ambient territory.
Also, regarding Shelley's points about black metal already being the logical conclusion, so there being no further, just no other option to go beyond that. I would also add that both musically and ideologically, the extremity of black metal, especially those acts like Ildjarn, is already, at least in the perspective of perhaps the mainstream, or not even the mainstream, but even, let's say, more moderate forms of metal or extreme music, it's already bordering on parody, maybe. So I would say that if you went even more extreme than that, you'd probably defeat the purpose by just becoming something. The main stimulus would be just to get more and more extreme, which I think that's not the case with black metal. The first black metal bands, I think they had some artistic substance beyond just that. But I'm not sure if there's any constructive project for a more extreme form of black metal, except the very idea of getting more extreme. We should be finally completely lapsing into parody. And I think that's why you already see some parody acts, or whenever black metal does get a mention in movies or media like that, it's usually sometimes in a comedic way, which is interesting considering the genre's ultra self-seriousness. And regarding the escape into ambient music, which Shelley was also talking about, I think that's, in a sense, that's the more mature way of, instead of what I was saying, instead of just going more extreme, I think the more mature way out is precisely that, is to try to maintain the spirit of black metal, but transposing it to another, a unique form that's still very interesting and holds a lot of potential. Yeah, I think that's why the fruits were really good with bands like Burzum or even Ildjarn when they did ambient.
Yeah, I think as well, the thing that we've kind of touched on but not really mentioned explicitly is black metal is very connected to national identity. So we're talking about Norwegian black metal. And this is more so than death metal. Although, like, Florida had a very distinct sound compared to Sweden, and so on in death metal. That was more to do with the style and the form that their interpretation of death metal took. Whereas with black metal, it's also about connecting with the national history. A lot of black metal utilizes folk music. You look to sort of Eastern Europe, and you've got bands like Nocturnal Mortem and Hate Forest, who very much connect with their Ukrainian identity. The Norwegian bands were very much, about saying we are Norwegian black metal, and we are connecting with a sort of deeper history. And any sort of new black metal scene that flourished after that did make a real point of connecting up with whatever kind of folk traditions, whether it's not just instrumentally in terms of folk music and instrumentation, but also mythology, going back into the theological history of a particular country, the myths and legends. And, drawing on that. I mean, it's probably one of the other legacies of Bathory, because he wasn't the first to start doing that, but he was definitely the most influential over extreme metal from the 80s onwards in terms of connecting what you do with your region. And I think that's one of the ways that black metal managed to reproduce itself from the late 90s onwards. But again, the quality of output from that time onwards would be contested. But I think because people had to believe that it was, rejuvenating itself, it kind of flushed out any opportunity for someone to come along and say, no, black metal's done now. Its identity is formalized. It's now stale. We need to create something new on top of that. I think that wasn't allowed because black metal started to self-regenerate by, each new region or area of the world that picked it up brought a slightly different interpretation to the form. And we're seeing that still carry on today with, areas in South America and Asia, and even Africa as well, sort of picking up on the template of black metal and bringing their own history and traditions to it as well. And it's more like incremental rather than some great split, as you saw in the early 90s when black metal split with death metal and very explicitly became combative towards it.
Yeah, Shelley, just a quick question before Roman jumps in. I know you reviewed that Tooless album. I think it was Pure Black Energy with the most iconic Norwegian black metal cover ever. But Tooless has never been really considered like canonical in terms of Norwegian black metal. Like especially the term true Norwegian black metal. So there's Norwegian black metal, but then there's also this other, more profound, culturally relevant, true Norwegian black metal. And Tooless has never really been considered as like true Norwegian black metal, but they are like Norwegian black metal that was around the scene. And what are your thoughts on Tooless with that Pure Black Energy, Shelley?
Well, I don't want to sound derogatory, but they're another sort of Me Too band in that you have the big four, and I hate using that word, apologies, but it just makes it easier when you have Emperor Immortal, Burzum, Darkthrone. You have them administrated by Mayhem. I've made clear on previous episodes that although Mayhem are, profoundly important to black metal, I don't think they stack up musically compared to the scene that they managed to administer. And then you have a whole host of Me Too bands. You could maybe include Enslaved because they only really manage one end-to-end quality album a day.
Over Satyricon.
Enslaved, Satyricon, Gehenna. Tooless are one of them in the album Pure Black Energy. It's a fine album, but it is very much like surplus to requirements in terms of it does what bands like Gorgoroth were doing on, say, Pentagram, just slightly flatter. There's elements to it that I like because, and that's what I would say is I like the black metal form. I like hearing it played well. And to that extent, I think the Tooless album is worth listening to, but it doesn't bring anything new to the table that a Darkthrone or a Gorgoroth were doing at the time, just better. So it's one of those albums that's for people that are interested in the form on an intellectual level as well as an emotional one. And I think that goes for a lot of other Norwegian acts where the drop in quality begins to really show when Satyricon get going, when 1349 get going.
Over.
Yeah, Ulver as well, where you can see them trying to be included in the in crowd, but they're creating an echo of what's come before. And yeah, although I know that, Ulver and Satyricon are very highly regarded in quote unquote the mainstream fandom of black metal, but to us we know that they were sort of creating an echo of what came before and very much kind of trying to ride on the coattails of this profoundly like captivating reputation that the foundational bands had built, and just not quite managing it, but they were very successful out of it.
Yeah, the foundational bands would be considered true Norwegian black metal, and the hangers-on like the Ulver, the Tooless, and the later Enslaved, all that is just Norwegian.
I mean, I don't like using the word true, and not just because it's become such a
I mean, they use
stupid
it. They
meme.
use it. I mean, that's their
No,
terminology.
I know they use it, but I don't. Again, I don't really take the statements of the artists themselves all that seriously. I think it's the listener's responsibility to interpret the artwork. And in interpreting the artwork, I don't like the word true, not just because it's a meme and it's kind of become a bit of a self-parody at this point, but I think you need to interrogate the word true. Well, what does it actually mean? What is it about the first clutch of Burzum and Dark Throne and Emperor albums that made them quote unquote true?
I think
Whereas Ulver and Satyricon and Gehenna were
synonym
not
would
true.
be authentic. The synonym would be authentic.
Potentially, yeah, but I wouldn't say that the hangers on were being inauthentic. I would just say they were not capable of. They were not as capable of creating a statement in that art form as profound as the statements created by Burzum and Immortal and so on. I think they were not as articulate within the form of black metal. I know that's a bit funky and it's much easier to say true, but
Over is for girls.
fuck off.
Roman, I know you were going to chime in earlier. Sorry for jumping on you. Go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. So I want to circle this back to Tyler's initial question, and I don't think it quite answers it. But the question fundamentally, why was there no rebuttal to black metal fundamentally? And I think it's useful. I don't think this is the ultimate answer, but I think it's useful to look at this, and maybe it helps get a clearer picture of the whole thing. Unlike thrash metal and death metal, there's a certain aspect to which black metal, and this is important to consider in the context of black metal being very consciously ideological compared to thrash metal and death metal. In the case of black metal, particularly the Norwegian scene, we see a few things happen here. So number one of its main founders dies, Euronymous, and then eventually two of its other very big ideological minds, Varg and Fenris, basically consciously reject black metal at a certain point. Varg particularly when he goes to prison and does the prison albums and whatever, and he goes into ambient music, and he really starts moving away from the concept of black metal at all, and speaks at least somewhat distantly of it, if not derisively of it. And later on, he comes back from jail, and that those albums afterwards are a write-off. But even then, he basically at a certain point is like, well, this is the last black metal song I'll ever do, and that's it. And he did it, and he doesn't do that anymore. But even before, you could see there was that rejection of the music from before, because actually probably for the same reasons that they rejected death metal, because of the trend and the template that was associated with it. If you look at Fenris, Fenris seeing what happened in the Norwegian black metal scene, it clearly put him into an ideological downward spiral, a depression of sorts, which definitely gets manifested very heavily around the time of albums like Sardonic Wrath and Hate Them. And the thing is, if you read interviews from the mid 90s before he's doing Panzerfaust, after Transylvanian Hunger, whatever. And he's just talking about how all he wants people to do is like go back and listen to more Celtic Frost and Bathory. And that's his point of doing things, which is interesting, but it's definitely a little bit different in terms of ideology from what happened before. So I would say that, and again, Fenris would kind of have the same criticisms about things becoming plastic, the trend. And then, he basically goes through this depression later in the late 90s, early 2000s, and comes out of it by returning to his childhood and getting back into traditional heavy metal and stuff like that. And that's where you see the new Dark Throne albums all come from. But basically, yeah, I essentially what we're looking at with the Norwegian black metal scene is either a conscious, implicit or explicit rejection of the style itself because it failed to do what it set out to do. It was no longer this elitist outsider music. It became something that everybody could copy, and the founders itself moved away from it in a much more quick fashion than previous genres would have done. Thrash metal bands were making thrash metal albums well into the 90s. Well, there's that whole groove metal thing going on there for a bit, but you know, even nowadays you'll have the classic bands, they're just pumping out albums just because. Same with death metal, but like the foundational black metal acts, you know, or at least some, there was a trend of some of the foundational black metal acts where they ended up rejecting the genre to some degree or another. And maybe that explains a little bit about why there is no rebuttal. Like, you can't kill
Deleted
something.
itself almost.
Yeah. You can't kill something that killed itself.
Yeah, your
You know?
case
Oh,
is
yeah, that's a fair
strengthened, I think, with Burzum, because if you even look at Burzum's post prison albums, the black metal albums post prison were the bad ones, and the ones that he made that were somewhat worth listening to were the ambient albums, which almost I
Exactly.
feel like just strengthens the case that he had rejected black metal, even though he was trying to make black metal. When he did try to make it, it didn't have any spirit to it. It felt like he was imitating imitators on those albums. He was imitating
Yes.
the bands that were imitating him.
No, he was
Yeah.
imitating himself, but you have to be honest with yourself. Those albums, the post prison Burzum albums, they were some of the best black metal albums that came out during that period, just because black metal had tatered off into really, really low quality realms. So I don't view him as negatively as other people do, but yeah, he's definitely just mimicking himself on that stuff.
Right. Yeah. And I'm not even saying that them being the worst post prison albums is a reflection of their overall quality. I was just saying that it's interesting that the man who rejected black metal, when he tried to make it again, couldn't make it to the same level of quality as he did in the creative peak of the genre, and that when he did make albums post prison that had some level of spirit to them, they weren't black metal.
Well, do you think there might be an element of like what could be considered like mental illness in the arts? Like a lot of people say you have to be part mad and part genius to create like really good art. And there were the murders, the arsons, and all that, so they're very monomaniacal. So you can take in consideration he wasn't as mentally ill, early on, later, in his life than he was early on. I
I think
I
that's
personally
true.
I personally think that a lot of youthful expression that came out, especially in early Norwegian black metal, if that came out and these guys were like 40, 50 years old, they would just be laughed off stage and considered like lunatics. So the youthfulness, I think, granted them, the ability to say, oh, these kids are just, being kids and all that. And, they're playing out in the forest, wearing armor and playing with swords and all that. And, conjuring forest trolls and burning down churches and killing each other. So it's just kids being kids rather than they're adults.
Well, yeah,
later in
I
life.
think if you listen to like later interviews from like Enslaved or Isan or some of the other acts from that time, they seem almost embarrassed to have been involved in black metal, which I think is why some of them have embraced progressive music so much, because they think it makes them look mature and like they've rejected the primitivism of black metal that they were involved in, and the silliness and the hokiness of it, and now they're into adult music or whatever. And similarly for Fenriz, is like, yeah, as you mentioned, like he just went back to his childhood and said, well, I love heavy metal, these are just heavy metal cross punk albums or whatever. And then to contrast that, you look at like the guys in Immortal who said, let's embrace the silliness, let's undermine the parody by just becoming a parody ourselves. And that's one way you can do it, and they were very successful off it. But yeah, the other artists, they seem almost embarrassed to have been involved in it at all and are trying to sort of overcompensate for that a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. I think that as you grow older with almost any person and you're inundated with greater levels of responsibilities, you start to prize discipline and control of your emotions more highly. And I think that when it comes to art, to some extent, not entirely, because there's always outliers and exceptions, that when you're dealing with, kind of as I said earlier, sculpting raw emotion, you have to have more flexible emotions than maybe the average person or someone who has to keep their emotions in check in order to be able to meet their responsibilities would, which means more flexible emotions translates to having greater highs and greater lows, which I guess kind of also lines up with Jason. That can kind of sort of parallel a sort of mental illness almost. But I think that's kind of like one of the more technical ways of expressing it, is that, you know, these people had more emotional expression in their music because they were in some ways more emotional individuals themselves when they were composing it.
Yeah, I can agree with that to an extent, but you have to take into consideration, you know, the more refined the art form, the more refined the individual who approaches it, you know, succeeds. Like in classical music, for instance, where a lot of the greatest composers, they don't reach their peak until, you know, late in their careers, even though
Lasted 1 hour, and then Jason mentioned classical. That's way longer than usual.
No, I mentioned
No, he-
Strauss earlier.
Yeah,
Oh, did you? Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, you're late to the game. Like 40 minutes ago, I mentioned Strauss and the Alpine Symphony.
Oh, you did, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, carry on.
That was back when we were talking about Ildjarn.
But Jason, you don't think that some of those classical composers were, especially, I mean, if we're going to talk about, I'll limit it specifically to romantic composers. That some of them, not all of those composers, but some of those great romantic composers were pretty emotional individuals themselves. Like, right, like Franz Schubert, arguably, especially like Robert Schumann, even Beethoven.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can do a deep dive into this right now if you want to. And Schumann tried to kill himself by throwing himself off the bridge, and the Rhine River, I think is what it's called. And he got put into an institution and he starved himself to death. But yeah, that falls into the world is not as beautiful to the composer. The real composer who has a lot to express, that the world is never as beautiful as it should be to them. That's why, you know, in their music they exude so much, you know, energy and emotion and, you know, excellence across the board. And when they're confronted with the harsh reality of mundane existence, I'm going to get Schopenhauerian, where they succumb to boredom and pain and suffering, which all, you know, people do succumb to eventually. And some people handle that differently. Some people are more mature. They just, you know, deal with it. They have thick skin and whatnot. And other people, like you talk about Schumann, you know, with his ailments. You can talk about Anton Bruckner with his nervous breakdown. He was institutionalized for a while there, and he actually went, you know, into the institution because he had a nervous breakdown while he was counting the leaves on a tree. You know, there's a lot of shit like that in classical music and art, and especially in a broader range of art. There's a lot of that where mundane reality is not as profound as the inner worlds of these individuals. But the thing about them succeeding later in life is that they've refined their craft so much that they just get better and better and better as they age. Whereas you look at, you know, Norwegian black metal, there was this huge youthful explosion of great quality music, and it just kind of petered out. So, and that might be the medium itself, where it's not as sophisticated as classical music is, where the better you get at it, you know, technically speaking of counterpoint and music theory and all that, the better your compositions become. That's not the case for black metal, where black metal is a rejection of form, essentially. So that's the classical rant for today. But yeah, I think there was a great emphasis on monomaniacal behavior in early Norwegian black metal, which propelled it to such heights in numerous ways, you know, artistic expression, as well as, you know, just making headlines with, you know, murdering each other and burning down churches, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, I chalk it up to be very youthful stuff. And I think if this was like, you know, classical musicians back then, I think they just would have been assimilated and just been composers and refined their crafts if they're inclined to do so. Technically speaking, but that's today's classical music rant. Roman, any thoughts on that? Or we have Tyler and Shelley who just jumped in, and there's the Roman.
Oh, I was just going to ask what Roman and Shelley's thoughts were on some of the points that I raised.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for what we're talking about right here. I think, well, yeah, definitely that's a huge contrast where you look at like classical music and how you look at Bruckner, you look at Beethoven, I guess Wagner and others too. Like, yeah, much later in life, some of their best works happen then. Doesn't necessarily happen with black metal right there. And I guess the thing that we're getting at right here, yeah, the emotional distance from the earlier works, and you do change with time. You do change with time, and there's this youthful exuberance expression that's just like, again, that raw emotion that comes out when you're younger that doesn't necessarily happen the same way when you're more mature. And essentially everybody ends up going through a little bit of a conundrum of how to express that properly musically in such a way that's it's still related to the earlier works. You find yourself, even as Tyler is kind of pointing out there with Vark, kind of like, you're imitating what you were doing before to a certain extent, or you're imitating the imitators. And I guess, for lack of a better word, the authenticity is lost in that process. Now, I mean, we can think of people that do get older that, quite frankly, get better with their craft. I think the one very good example of this is Yen from Samoth. The most recent Samoth album might be some of their best work. And I mean, he's certainly.
I disagree.
Yes, I know. But point being, I would, and I, but I disagree with you there. So the point is that, he's no spring chicken. And even if we're going to write off the most recent album, Godless Arrogance certainly came into being at a time in his life where he's older.
That's their best album, Godless Arrogance. That was, Tyler, correct me if I'm wrong, 2013, correct? So 9 years ago.
Yeah, it was 2013 when that came out.
Yeah, so that's quite old now, Roman.
Yeah. No, it is. But
it was already late in his career, is what I think Roman was saying, which is true.
Yeah,
I mean, he had already released what was it? Like maybe 6 albums or so by the time that one came out.
No, yeah, exactly. And I think the form of some of these other bands is a little different, and it doesn't necessarily hold true completely because in Summoning's case anyways, that's their last one wasn't that great, but Summoning, for example, was able to keep the craft going for quite a while. And maybe that just has to do with the fact of the nature of the music, the form of the music being somewhat different, leading into what at the time people would have called neoclassical kind of elements, and now what people would refer to in retrospect as dungeon synth. Because of the nature of that form, I guess it's easier to keep doing that as you get older. Graveland also, really sustained the quality of their music over time, in a weird way too, because they kind of just, Rob Darkin. Well, Rob Darkin would just kind of, let's put it this way. I think he did a lot of like B, C level stuff for a long time, but he never got really bad. Post Memory and Destiny, but he kind of came back to like more A-level material with stuff like Thunderbolts of the Gods and what was that one, Cold Winter Blades. There's a few other ones from around that time, but the point being, it never got really he never really had the huge downfall in quality that the other Norwegian acts did. Well, because not Norwegian, but that also has to do with the fact that his form again is much more rooted in this kind of folk aspect that's very related to the, I guess, more nationalistic expressions in his music, the whole pagan folk thing. So, you look at Summoning and Graveland, and I think this kind of parallels what we're talking about with the classical thing. I'm not comparing them necessarily on that level, but because the nature of the form is different, it makes it easier to continue to write that kind of music as you get older. I don't know if that really addresses much you were talking about there, Tyler, but hopefully it riffs off it a little bit.
Yeah, I think it was an interesting insight. I'm kind of interested to hear what Shelley specifically has to say about more emotional individuals and their connection to making art and the quality of the art.
Well,
Well,
Behared is not emotional at all. Like I don't
well,
know if you guys have been to Finland, but they do not express emotions there. They're very introverted. Yes, he could be internally emotional. If he is, I have not experienced that with meeting him and knowing him. So yeah, I'm unsure.
I
It's
think
a cultural thing.
I generally agree with everything that's been said so far, and yeah, yeah. To your point, Jason, as well, Norway as well. Norwegians are much more stoic than we are in the UK or you guys in the US as well. And I think this is one of the other reasons why the individuals in the Norwegian scene are often misunderstood by quote unquote Western media. And I think the other element to this question is just that the media response to black metal. Like there's the really famous Kerrang cover issue on black metal from back in the day when everything kind of blew up, but because of the extreme acts of that particular scene, it has been subject to more media scrutiny than is normal for an extreme metal subgenre. Although death metal got a lot of attention back in the day, it was largely judged based on the merits of the music itself. Whereas black metal, I think, although the artists liked to swagger about and say we play black metal and we don't care what you think, I think they really did care. And like as has already been mentioned, Fenriz, had a long period of depression as a result of not just what happened to the scene, but the response to it and how it was kind of distorted and caricatured as it went on. And I think it's impossible for the artists most responsible for this to not absorb some of that and start second guessing everything that they started doing. And I think, that's one of the reasons why Varg's post prison albums kind of stuttered a bit. He's not an idiot. He was probably aware of how much pressure was on those albums, like probably the most infamous comeback albums ever, because it's not just I've had a long hiatus, it's I've been in prison for murdering someone for many, many years, and I'm now returning to a form of music that I've been away from for so long and has evolved a great deal. But I am one of the foundational acts in that. It's a huge amount of pressure to put on yourself to even contemplate adding to the conversation again. And I think that's why those albums stutter a little bit. And I think that's why the other bands tried to escape from that legacy, tried to escape from making black metal at all. Because the scrutiny of it is too much. And that must be have a profound effect on your psychology, because it's music that you're deeply personally connected to. It's part of your identity. And now you're sort of seeing it be interpreted, warped, distorted, and in some cases ridiculed in many different ways. And it's hard to understand that you no longer control that legacy, your legacy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Jason brings up Beharit, one of my favorite bands of all time, by the way, as an exemplar of the Finnish black metal scene, which they certainly are, especially classic Finnish black metal. And talking about the Finnish character, which I'm well aware of, of being very stoic, because in Finland you do have this interesting sort of dichotomy between the Finnish black metal that came out during the classic period of black metal, like Beharit and Impaled Nazarene, and if I'm not mistaken, maybe you could shelve like Mythos into that into that group. But then you have later Finnish black metal like Horna, right, is a later Finnish black metal band, and
Yeah.
that variety of Finnish black metal I would classify as being quite sentimental. I'm not necessarily a fan of that style, but it's interesting that like such a sentimental style of black metal would come from a group of people that, as Jason pointed out rightly, I would add, are known for being quite stoic and not very expressive about their emotions.
I thought Marco fucking hated me for a moment there. And then I was like, oh no, it's just Finnish. That's no small talk, it's just straight to the beef of the matter. But yeah, there is When Joseph April was on, he did talk about his experience in Norway was really similar to my experience in Finland, where us Westerners, like such as America and the UK and all that, we tend to be more expressive. We tend to be more chatty and communicative than our Scandinavian friends, if you want to consider Finland part of Scandinavia, which I kind of do a little bit. But yeah, it's really interesting that the Norwegian side of it. So on the exterior, these people are probably really well composed, and not like Americans are, of just having their hearts on their sleeves and just reacting like almost like a knee-jerk reaction to the external stimulus. They're very reserved, creating some of the most expressive music made in extreme metal. So I'm glad we were able to touch on this today, because I didn't expect that. I thought it would just be like random ideas and takes on black metal, but we got into some really interesting characteristics. So did you guys want to move on to the Finnish topic and wrap up, or do you have more to say about Norwegian black metal?
Well, I was going to hand to Raphael because I've noticed he's been quiet for a while. If you have any final thoughts.
All right, but about Norwegian black metal in general, or what exactly? Because it's been a dense conversation so far.
Well, yeah, or like the emotional aspect to it as well. Just anything we've been discussing.
Yes, I agree. It makes sense that the more emotional expression inherent in black metal came from a sort of repressed, or at least a type of people that are at least stereotypically considered very repressed on that level. Well, I think that goes for pretty much all of the characteristics of black metal, because the fact that it's almost a perfect country in terms of most of the criteria by which you make these evaluations, and the whole civilization, etc. So these call back to primordial bestiality and the charm and the appeal of the woods and darkness, etc. And I also think, going back to a point that you made, that Shelley made on earlier, about how this genre was received, how well and how easily it was received by the American scene or scenes. I think that also has a lot to do with the emotional expression, because I think there is a reason why the indie bands of the United States, why they didn't incorporate death metal at all, or doom metal, or anything like that. I think it's there has to be a reason why they went specifically for this very specific icy, atmospheric, ambient-like type of music, and I think it's precisely because the melancholy and the dark emotional content inherent in Norwegian black metal was precisely what resonated with these people. Of course, in a very unique twist and interpretation, but there was at least some level of resonance that was enough for them to find it interesting and to try to do something with it. So in a sense, if you think of a continuum in terms of music with a lot of emotional potential, or with a lot of let's say a cathartic character, if you think of a continuum between I think you can conceive a sort of a scale that has somewhere Norwegian black metal and bands like well, I don't know, but any band like any of the classic acts, and on another all those things that those indie bands were into. So it's a totally different type of catharsis and a totally different type of emotion. But what's in common is just the emphasis on raw, expletive, emotional expurgation, so to speak. And I think that's precisely the aspect that enchanted those bands, and that's why black metal became popular then. And well, that's the origin of all the Death Evans and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm currently writing an academic paper, quote unquote, on Schopenhauer's aesthetics with a very specific topic within there. And part of music being transcendental for Schopenhauer is that it must have like a self-negation, like you lose yourself in the music, you become part of it, your psyche's so absorbed with it that you're not really concerned about your mundane desires and life and all that. And that might be a great emphasis on black metal there, where especially there's a different realm, listening to music versus writing it. So that catharsis, that losing oneself while writing the music, expressing something beyond the individual, writing it. That could be why they're so monomaniacal with their external affairs, the empirical affairs, such as burning down churches and killing each other. They're just so absorbed within the music itself, the expression, the spirit, that it became detrimental to their personal lives.
Yeah,
So
I liked what Raphael said about the sort of catharsis of like repressed emotional content. It reminded me of a statement that Fenrir made in that Until the Light Takes Us documentary of sorts, where he said he didn't like the paintings by that Brazilian painter because they had a certain political content to them about the repression of women in Brazilian society. And he said that he preferred art that was made by, I'm really roughly paraphrasing him here, by troubled youth in sort of idyllic circumstances. And I think that kind of relates to what Raphael was saying and talking about the kind of contrast between the intense emotional expression of black metal versus the sort of stoic and reserved exterior.
I think he was referring to like the tyranny of boredom, in that Norway was a very tranquil country. It's got a very strong sort of social security system. It's very kind of rural. And he was saying Brazil and other kind of art from South American countries is very colorful, it's very exuberant, it's very celebratory. And he was kind of contrasting that with Northern Europe to some extent, but Norway and Scandinavia in particular, and saying like these are very comfortable, well-off countries, and they're so tedious and boring. And that partly explains why something like black metal happened there, because it was almost like an alter ego for these people. They needed some expression or outlet to counter the tyranny of boredom.
Right, and it almost kind of dovetails with the Schopenhauerian things that Jason was talking about a little bit, transcending
100%
mundane
does.
existence. Yeah.
100% does. Yeah.
And back to Shelley, just being an European as well, you'll probably know that. I think you'll agree that the system in the Scandinavian countries is more or less it's pretty much considered the peak of what the European project since World War II more or less tried to be. So yes, I think that makes sense. And I'm also interested in knowing your thoughts about this aspect of this potential reason of why black metal was so easily accommodated to the American to those American scenes that came up with post-black and etc. This has to do with the emotions as well, with this cathartic aspect.
Yeah, I think so. Just trying to sort of formulate. I think what I've kind of always been touching on with the American bands is they took the flavor. So I know food analogies could be a bit annoying in music, but I'm going to use one to explain it. In that you have a meal and then you have the spices and the flavors that you apply on top. But you have the substance of the meal, the actual things that go into it, the meat and the potatoes and the veg or whatever. And the Americans basically did the equivalent of taking the spice mix of black metal and then applying it to their own substantive music. And in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that. It happens all the time in culture, and particularly in music as well. And the Norwegians, the flavor of black metal really resonated with some people in North America and the UK to some extent. Even though it was something that we couldn't create ourselves, they kind of tapped into what you'd almost call a universal sort of desire amongst certain sections of the youth. But there's still this substantive aspect, this substantive Norwegian character in the music of the classic acts that the Americans were unable to or weren't interested in. And I think you touched on it as well, Raphael, when you said they weren't interested in, say, death metal. Death metal is much more formal and sort of has quite rigorous compositional forms. There's a lot of variety within that, like Cynic's very different from Asphyx, for example, but it's much more, there's much less room for stamping your own character in the way that these American bands did. They wanted to bring their own individualist, personal, emotional expressions. We've talked a lot about emotions, but we haven't discussed the fact that this wasn't sort of emo music. It wasn't them saying, it wasn't like depressive black metal, I'm suicidal, I'm upset, and I'm going to express that in the music. It's very anti-individual. The individual is suppressed in the lyrics, if there are lyrics at all. They're talking about ancient mythology, reverence for nature, or they're just removing the lyrics entirely, as Iljan did with a lot of his work. And the Americans kind of, I keep saying the Americans, I know that there are plenty, like this is a certain section of, say, post-2000, post-black metal that I'm referring to here, but they wanted to take that flavor, but apply it to an individualist emotive expression where the substance would be, sort of a form of post-rock, but with the flavoring of black metal. And it gave them a new language to express that. And again, in and of itself, that's not, they're entitled to do that. But for me, it kind of, it strips the essence of black metal that made it so attractive, this suppression of the individual. It's still a highly emotive expression, but it's not sentimental, not kind of self-indulgent in a way. It's as someone already mentioned as well, it's cathartic. It's much more sophisticated than that.
Yeah, it's like self-pitying, the kind of post-black metal or black gaze approach. I think that the emotional impact of the classic Norwegian black metal was the emotional response to the imagery, I'm using that term very loosely, presented. When you're talking about ancient ruins or mountains or storms or anything like that, it can provoke a very powerful emotional response within the listener, but it's not an emotional response in the sense that it's sort of narrating your own personal emotional journey. I'm sad because of this event, or I'm upset, so on and so forth. It's not self-pitying emotion. So I think that's like an important distinction to be made. But there is a small amount of crossover in that having that level of emotional expression can appeal to an emotional individual who primarily, communicates emotional expression through personal emotion, through that kind of self-pitying impulse.
That's more or less what I was getting at. I think that's why I mentioned interpretation. I think they took the approach, or the emphasis, at least, the emphasis on the emotion, but again, like Shelley said, this more impersonal, transcendental aspect, which I would say is probably, at least to me, and I would say for most people who like this type of music, is probably the most interesting aspect of Norwegian black metal. And but they took that, and they shaped it to their purposes. But in general, I would say that these resonance that we mentioned are the reason why this form of music was so attractive to these musicians. Of course, these are complex matters and they vary from band to band, but I would say that generally speaking, they probably come down to, to this emphasis on emotion, the idea of atmosphere as well. She is something that I think Norwegian black metal developed to a very unique state, a very unique form. And yes, I think it comes down to those things mainly. And also perhaps along with the concordant with these things is probably also the idea of introspection. I think that we probably agree that Norwegian black metal, compared to all forms of metal that came before it, is a very introspective type of music. It's as if it's set in it's almost meditative sometimes, and I think that's also something that enticed those American bands, even though they took it in another direction, in a more let's say in a more personal. It's still let's say it's still an introspective area, introspective state of mind, but not so much directed at pure contemplation, like nature, the contemplation of nature, but more, let's say, the contents of the mind itself, and let's say the past, whatever problems, basically what Tyler was saying about the self-pity, etc.
Yeah, I think it's humbling. I think that's the word I was trying to grasp earlier on, is the Norwegian style. It humbles the individual at the same time as providing that introspection. And I think a band like Leviathan or Exasper, they were more, to put it really derogatorily, treating black metal as sort of personal therapy in a way, like going on a personal emotional journey. And there's space for music that expresses that, but again, like I said, that's not what I go to black metal for. I don't go
That sounds more like rock music, what rock music's about, where it's all about personal expression and
Oh no.
hashtag not all rock music. Don't open that can of worms.
I was gonna make the point that in kind of going for the personal self-pitying direction, Raphael mentioned a lot of people, that's what they go to black metal for. I think that you could argue that in varying degrees, a lot of people went to heavy metal in general for that, for an escape from the self. Kind of talking about Jason Schopenhauerian aesthetics. People wanted to escape from mundane existence. They wanted to escape from the sort of social consensual reality.
I think you're giving people too much credit, Tyler, honestly.
Well, I mean, this is like a generalization, right? I'm not saying it's an exact description of everybody's thoughts when they went to go listen to heavy metal, but I think that you could roughly say that a lot of people were attracted to the genre because, unlike many other genres of music, not entirely. You can find examples in progressive rock and in punk rock and in just about anything, electronic music, ambient music. But unlike in a lot of genres of other modern genres of music, heavy metal would tend towards topics that transcended the individual, and it provided a certain kind of escape in a similar fashion to maybe a fantasy novel. And that kind of allowed you to escape yourself or escape the everyday reality you found yourself in. And black metal, I think, was a very heightened expression of that. So I would say that to some extent, you could argue that those indie black metal bands, those post black metal bands, and I think this is a tendency that got exacerbated as it further went on from Leviathan and Xasthur on up through Krallis and
Twilight.
Death Heaven. Yeah, and Twilight. I think that they were almost kind of regressing that tendency in heavy metal that people find attractive about it, or in black metal in this particular instance. They were kind of almost making it, dare I say, less metal by doing that.
All right, can I say something really quick before Raphael jumps in? So I would attribute what you said to maybe 5% of metal listeners. And the reason why is because most people hold music as adornment for their personalities or individual personas that they want to portray to other people in a social setting. I would say that is more akin to rock music, and then you find a lot of people in the rock music who are like that, where it's all about their individual expression and love songs and all kinds of very mundane things, whereas metal, it denies the individual. At a certain point, a metal listener must realize that it denies the listener, the individual, and it becomes about something grander, something about the beyond, something beyond grasp, and it's presenting, through very harsh textures, very threatening textures, especially with Ildjarn. It's expressing, something completely rejecting the mundane world. And whereas rock music and about 95% of metal listeners, I would say, the Slipknot fans to even like your cookie cutter death metal fans, as I listen to Obituary and Death and blah blah, but also like Killswitch Engage, all those people, they are not into metal for metal reasons. It's all social. It's all about the individual and their expression. It's just you put up a painting in your living room. That's what metal is to them. It's just something
Well, yeah,
to portray to other people.
right. There's a spectrum, but I mean, you don't think that to some extent, maybe a lesser extent than somebody who's deeply thought about it, and has like these kind of thoughts about something like Burzum, but to maybe a lesser extent, you don't think that when people listen to Man-O-War making songs about epic battles and medieval times, that there's at least some shade of the experience of wanting to escape mundane existence, maybe into some sort of cheesy, goofy, like medieval action movie, but they're still wanting to escape
Manowar is
the
a very social band. You understand that, right? It's all about
yeah,
fucking
yeah,
middle, and it's anthemic. Like
of
it's
course, but I'm
anthem
just
of
like
metal.
making the point that that tendency has always been in metal. I mean, I would say that tendency is in something like Man-O-War or Judas Priest, but to a much lesser developed extent than it is in something like the finest works by like Darkthrone or Immortal.
I think what we're trying to express and what makes Norwegian black metal, especially its own thing and very special within the metal canon, is that it 100% does reject the individual. And I think that's what makes it really special, because it's all about the cathartic release, as Raphael was saying. And Raphael, you did want to chime in. I'm sorry for stepping on you.
Oh, no, no problem. I was just going to suggest that I think this is a very interesting point that we've gotten to with Tyler saying that that more post-metal style, it sort of undoes the transcendental focus of black metal. And I was thinking that maybe because earlier on we were talking about where to go after black metal. So in a sense, if you think of the story, the history of metal as this increasing focus on the transcendental and even the non-human, the sacred. Maybe when you get to, like, could we say that maybe when we get to black metal, which is the more extreme form of that, we sort of circle back again with that incarnation with the post-black metal bands. We circle back to the, once we've gotten to the furthest point, we just go back to the more almost rock or just pop type of concerns. And I think there is some truth to this, because as we were talking about earlier, Fenrir is saying that he disliked Frida Kahlo because of the social aspect, and he was more into the type of art that is not, that doesn't have at all that type of personal or even social dimension. And if you look at Death Heaven, for example, they literally have lyrics that are about social issues. So I think that there is some at least some, even if it's not a conscious thing, as these things rarely are. I think there is indeed some truth to the fact that to this type of to this overview of the history of metal, where once you get to the more the most extreme form of this tendency to ignore the human and the more let's say personal aspects, at the end of that you just it's rebranded. The black metal, the surface style, is rebranded with it sort of circles back to the very beginning, the departure.
Yeah, it's interesting because I do to some extent agree with what Jason was saying, in that a lot of listeners use music as a form of sort of personality ornamentation, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, we're overly obsessed with music, and it's what we do with most of our time, so it's natural that we would give it a great deal of thought, particularly the works that we hold in very high regard. And for a lot of people it's just background noise, which nothing wrong with that. But then the shift in the sort of fandom that followed bands like Liturgy and Death Heaven and Kralis and Alcest and a handful of others was kind of mistaking that for the kind of analysis that we're trying to conduct here, in that they still see music as a vehicle for personal expression, for self-expression, and they use the forms of and the techniques of black metal to do that, and they call it black metal, but they don't understand or want to understand the essence of the form that they're borrowing. And again, you could say, well, they don't have to, they're creating their own thing and it's allowed to exist. But again, my point is always don't mistake it for the real thing. Don't denigrate the music that you're borrowing from because you just refuse to properly engage with it on its own terms, and engage with the complex history of it. I don't think the original Norwegian bands were sort of, posturing in the same way. They were trying to add to the conversation of metal thus far as it was, and they were very clearly very clear on what their thoughts on that were, but they were also trying to very much bring a unique angle on it, not their own identity or their own personal expression or whatever, but a kind of almost a wish fulfillment. It's like, this is what metal could be used to express, and this is what it could tap into on a more universal level. And I think that's what's missing from a lot of the black metal that followed, because it missed that fundamental point that you're having a two-way conversation with history. You're not just using it as a vehicle to work through a period of depression or whatever.
Yeah, well, it's hard to have a conversation with the history of metal when, hate to be a bit of a gatekeeper here, you're an outsider. Now, a lot of those bands, I mean, not all of them, but a lot of those bands consisted of outsiders from like the punk rock or indie rock scene.
Well, yeah, and to be fair to Liturgy, I know they caused a lot of controversy with the Transcendental black metal essay, but they never wanted to be involved in black metal. They liked black metal and they took influence from it, but it was a few unfortunate articles calling them the future of black metal that got them involved in that scene at all. They didn't want to be a part of it, so all of the hatred that they got was kind of almost accidental as far as they were concerned. And I know a lot of bands that followed kind of did start to insert themselves into that conversation, say we're the future of metal, like the black metal thing before was immature, but we can take the best of that, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. And you're right, it's because they weren't fully conversant in the history. They weren't, they didn't see, for instance, the wisdom of someone like Summoning or Beherit or Varafron adding just as much to the conversation about black metal, but doing wildly different things with the form to the Norwegian bands. But they weren't interested in engaging with black metal on that level. They just thought, wow, that guitar turns cool. I'll lift that and call myself black metal and apply it to my own form of indie music. But they weren't engaging with the wider, like, narrative of metal history going on in the early 90s.
Yeah, kind of tracking back to earlier in the conversation, back when we got into the Canadian black metal conversation and Ledney, saying that as long as it's really satanic, it's black metal. I kind of share that kind of sentiment, and to even an extent that black metal doesn't have to be necessarily black metal in socially accepted terms. It could be completely through a different medium, as long as it espouses the same spirit that black metal has. It's kind of getting into like adjacent projects, and like people will say like things are fucking metal, right? Because it's heavy and whatnot. I think black metal has its own spirit that's even beyond, that quote unquote metal spirit. And the Norwegians tapped into it, the Canadian black metal bands, quote unquote, tapped into it in their own way. And I truly believe, to be the champion of diversity here, is that as long as there's a certain spirit, that genuine black metal can be achieved regardless of the region that it's from. Like, there could be genuine African black metal, but it may not have elements of, Norwegian black metal at all, but it's a shared sentiment among the people. It could be about African witchcraft and all this, and delving into their own culture. Same thing for the Chinese. There could be like really dark aspects of the Chinese culture that, these people could start, expressing in, really harsh forms of music. And I think once we talked about the Norwegian template, but once we take it on a larger scale, a more universal scale, I think it is more akin to what Ledney was saying that black metal is, and it is really amorphous. It's more about that spirit, And unfortunately, we cannot ever pin down a spirit. We cannot define it. We cannot clearly communicate what it is and what it is not. But once we see it, we know it just by, experiencing it. That is, that spirit of black metal being presented in another format. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's what makes music such a profound form of communication. It's that it can communicate the unquantifiable, and the unquantifiable is kind of the essence of experience, because verbal communication is just a means of obtaining a certain correspondence with others. But really, the heart of experience is something that can't fully be communicated. It's something that it can only be felt within the individual, and music is one of the only ways of coming as close as possible to communicating that experience, precisely because of the fact that in the best forms of music, in my opinion, it's a nonverbal form of communication. It almost communicates pure experience or pure happening. So I think that you're very much on point with that. And I think that, just like you said, that's the reason why what black metal is, so to speak, can be communicated anywhere, regardless of circumstance, regardless of specific cultural aspects or specific circumstances that you're in. There's a sort of unquantifiable, transcendent experience that can be expressed through that form of music. And talking about like darker aspects, so to speak, which black metal focuses on, of any kind of culture from Chinese to African to Norwegian. It just really reminds me of the song from Mayhem, the Pagan Fear song. That's something that is just an essential part of our experience of this world, is like the darker aspects of our past, of our history, on up through the present day. They're alive, as much as we may want to try to ignore them.
Yeah, that kind of gets into trauma being passed down through generations. Raphael, have you ever delved into that? Like, how, like some downtrodden people may still, I'm getting into kooky shit, but, generations later, that trauma is still felt on like a subconscious level, like delving into Jung and all that. What are your thoughts on that? Like, historically speaking, like really harsh aspects of reality. Like the Norwegians were Vikings. They dealt with, way in the past they were Vikings, and they experienced a lot of death and tragedy and all that. And there's like a shared consciousness of that. Even today, is like you look at Scandinavia, immediately you think about, the historical significance of it. Raphael, do you think that plays any part in it, like on a psychological level, delving into the more mystical side of Jung?
So you're talking more about, let's say, the intergenerational trauma, right?
Yeah. Do you think that's a real thing?
Well, I think that there is some basis. Well, I think it's not really. Genetics exist, but I wouldn't say it is. I'd say the reality of that comes down more to cultural conditioning, as in those things that happen generations ago. They shape the people who lived it, which in turn shape their children, the people they raise. So it's all about the cultural environment. A certain inheritance being handed down almost subliminally between from generation to generation. But I think within music and within black metal in specific, I think that's more of let's say an aesthetic element that the bands consciously choose to pick and to color, so to speak, their own emotions and their own experiences. Because I do know that this was a talking point. This was a conscious talking point by some bands. Like I know that, for example, Varg, for example, he did mention a lot the trauma. Well, a big point of a big element of his earlier music is the trauma that Christianity inflicted on the native pagan peoples, and he portrays it in an almost diabolical way. Even if you look at the cover of his first ambient album, for example, I think that's very explicit. And that's, well, maybe bands like the bands that really, really plays with the Viking inheritance. They, all of them, in a sense, got into this idea of the trauma, and especially the trauma of being cut off from your natural environment, from your natural culture. This very abrupt cutting off. I think that's definitely an element of the music and the culture surrounding it. Bands like Enslaved, Burzum, of course. But I think it's something that they consciously choose to approach, and it's something that it's let's say a filter that they chose to apply to their own emotions, their own anger. Just maybe they were analogous. They were feeling something analogous to that. A sense of being cut off, because as we were talking about this, the early 90s was probably the period where people like some cultural analysts like Francis Fukuyama or the neoliberal theorists, for example, they sort of place and people like Baudrillard, for example, they sort of place the early 90s as the most definitive. Of course, it's a process that is constructed throughout time, but maybe that's the with stuff like the Iraqi war and the Yugoslav wars, and the way a new order was built after that, a new international neoliberal order. The fall of the Soviet Union as well is a big element as well. So a lot of theorists place that moment as the very beginning of these internet, these new these new like international these new the end of history basically. And as we were saying, Scandinavia is a huge example of it, because as I was saying, it's probably the most perfect mirror image of the European, the post-war European slightly social democratic project. So these guys, they lived more or less, they were raised a bit before, during that process, so they probably also felt a very radical cut off with the pre-existing traditions, to a lesser degree, of course, than than in like the Middle East or whatever. But I think to a certain extent they might have felt the this transition. So yeah, I think it's natural that they would like to go back to they would like to put themselves next to periods in history where something like that happened in a much greater scale, like the Christianization of Europe. So yes, I think a long-winded response. I know I went into some stuff that's probably not as directly related to what you asked, but yeah, I think that's my thoughts. Yeah.
No, you answered it. That probably not generational trauma, quote unquote, to create those expressions, but a rejection of how good the utopia is, quote unquote, in Scandinavia nowadays versus what the roots were, and wanting to return to the roots. Just to wrap up today's episode, we've been going for 2 hours. What are your thoughts on Finnish black metal versus Norwegian black metal? I'll start with Shelly. Like, which one do you feel as both are equal, or is one better than the other, or they're just two distinctly separate things that should not be placed side by side? Because obviously they're not that far from each other in that part of the world, so there was a lot of overlap of sentiments and things going on. And we're talking about the pagan aspects of Norway. There was some great pagan aspects of Finland, which I got to experience firsthand about out in the woods. I just saw like a big rock which had the top carved out of it, which was an offering for the birds, because they believed the ancestors were reincarnated in the birds. So they give a lot of offerings to the birds. And I saw other occult things. And another thing about the occultism in Finland, the pagan aspect, is that very bad people were executed, and they hung the bones of those criminals in front of their homes to keep out evil spirits. So you'd be walking across like a normal aspect of the city or town or whatnot, and you'll just see all these fucking bones and stuff hanging from people's houses. But it was to ward off evil spirits. So there was, a great aspect of pagan elements in Finland as well, not just Norway. But Shelley, do you view um, them as equals, Norwegian black metal and Finnish black metal as equal, or do you view it as uncomparable? What's your view on that?
Well, as I've already sort of framed earlier, I do hold them as comparable, and I do hold them as sort of equally profound but highly distinct interpretations of the same idea. And as I mentioned, like there were many bands across Europe and the US who were exploring the alternative version of extreme metal to what thrash and death metal were doing in the late 80s. And from that, you get black metal. And Norway was one interpretation of that, and Finland was another. And I've mentioned, there was an Austrian scene, there was a Greek scene, there was a fledgling scene in the US, and there was an Eastern European scene as well. And they were all doing the same thing spiritually, just musically, it came out very differently. And I think what's really interesting about the Finnish scene, and this to some extent is true of the death metal that was made at the time as well, is this surrealist aspect to it. So you've got Beherit, Impaled Nazarene, Belial, Mythos. They all borrow heavily from grindcore, and they all create a much more like furious, dirty, primal, non-melodic interpretation of black metal. But there's this bizarre surrealism that comes through as well, where it's not, to me, it's not evocative of paganism or the kind of reverence for history and nature that Norway was getting at. It's much more like psychologically disturbing, whether it's like the extremity that Impaled Nazarene were kind of grasping for, where it's almost comedic, but it's delivered so sincerely that you kind of have to stand up and kind of watch it happen. It's almost like, I don't know, being kicked in the balls or something. And Belial, Wisdom of Darkness EP, again, it's sort of like they sound like a death metal band or a grindcore band playing black metal, but they tap into this kind of primal fury. And of course, Beherit, by the time he's releasing Drawing Down the Moon, it feels almost like an electronica album, but played through the vehicle of this dirty, primal, like early interpretation of black metal. And there's such a weird and wonderful atmosphere to that album that is like, it creates an alternative version of the atmospheres that Burzum were going for instance. It's like, here's the expanded universe, here's like the other side of black metal and what it can do on a aesthetic and atmospheric level that is just the perfect kind of other side of the coin to what the Norwegian bands were doing for me. So yeah, I would hold them in equally high regard and put them next to each other as just different branches of an evolution that was happening in the early 90s, along with a few other branches that were happening at the same time.
I see. Tyler, do you think you can compare the two like Shelley did, or should they be separated in your vision of like black metal expressions? Like, are they just two distinctive, separate things, just doing their own thing? Like Shelley said, there's the shared spirit. And I think that is important. I do view, I share that sentiment. There is definitely the shared spirit. But what's your view, Tyler?
Well, when it comes to Finnish black metal, like Beherit in particular, their album Drawing Down the Moon is one of my most listened to albums, top 10. I listen to it quite often, and in a manner somewhat similar, although through different means, to other of my most listened to albums like World Downfall by Terrorizer or Enjoy the Violence by Massacre. It definitely provides that transcendental escape from mundane existence, but in a way I can map it onto my daily experience to provide almost a sense of motivation. I can now look at my daily experience through a different context as utilizing it to achieve something that is parallel to that kind of transcendental vision. Norwegian black metal, on the other hand, what I would consider the best examples of it, I listen to far more infrequently, and that may imply that I think it's of lesser quality. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think that Norwegian black metal has a very different effect upon me, at least those examples that I'm talking about, what I would consider the best of it, where it is almost in a sense, not necessarily in a negative way, emotionally draining. It reduces emotion to such, like personal emotion anyway, to such an extent that I almost have to listen to it in very particular circumstances. And it sounds cliche, but for instance, there's certain Norwegian black metal albums that I mostly listen to at night during the winter, which in my part of the world, we have colder, darker winters. And in that case, I would say that I don't think that Norwegian black metal is of lesser quality than Finnish black metal, or vice versa, that Finnish black metal is of lesser quality than Norwegian black metal. I just think that while they have a similar spirit, while they both are kind of trying to reduce the extraneous trappings of music to communicate something more transcendent in a more direct way through sort of the raw sculpture of melody, that they do so through different means and thus serve different purposes. Good music is good music, but I also think that sometimes different kinds of good music have different utilities. And I kind of think that somewhat expresses my feelings on the differences between the Finnish and the Norwegian scenes.
What strikes me as funny is that I immediately went to the question as Norwegian versus Finnish black metal, but I didn't even think about Swedish black metal because it's so non-important. Like there's what Sacramento, for the
Well,
Swedish.
there's also Dawn, there's Vinterland, there's well, I know you dissection probably don't fall into the black metal category, but they are still an important kind of chapter in the Swedish extreme metal of the 90s. And we also haven't mentioned like Abruptum, who, although they were more of like a weird drone experimental act, they fall into the black metal milieu by default almost. And I don't think they were representative of Sweden at all, but I think Sweden really brings to the fore the melodic expression of black metal via a kind of heavy metal vocabulary. But I still think that's important to kind of highlight as a sort of another kind of angle to take on the sort of template that we've been dancing around that was being worked on during the early to mid 90s.
Yeah, Roman, go ahead.
Yeah, very briefly, I think Swedish black metal is only really relevant in a negative sense. No, that's obviously excluding the greats of Sacramentum and Dissection, and Dawn had its moments too, and there was some good stuff there. But like when I think Swedish black metal, I just think, I think Watain and I think Dark Funeral, and I think of the kind of the nadir of ripping off De Mysteriis Domsatanas and Transylvanian Hunger in the worst possible way. Aside from that, getting back to the Finnish Norwegian thing, yeah, Beharit is top tier and released even late into the career. Like, come on, Engram was, who saw that coming? Who saw that coming? So we can definitely talk about the incredibly high quality of a band like Beharit, but honestly, failing Beharit, as good as the other Finnish bands are, I don't really think there's anything but Beharit that really contends with the Norwegian greats.
Nor's, what is it called? I'm sorry, I've had a few beers. The Impaled Nazarene.
Yeah, Toll Thompson Norris. Yeah.
That's a good one. And also Ugur Kamra.
Ugur Kamra is a fantastic album.
No question.
I always say it's better than the debut in a lot of ways. It kind of encapsulates a compositional ambition whilst maintaining the raw fury. But yeah, like the output is much more patchy if you take Finland as a whole, and it's much less consistent than what Norway were doing. But I still think at its best it does compete. But
I think it does too. Like I realize, like I've listened to a shit ton of Immortal, Emperor, Burzum. and I have also equally listened to that Beheaded and Impaled Nazarene. Raphael, what are your thoughts on the? Since we got into like the nationalistic side of black metal, obviously, the Finnish black metal is quite big, and Norwegian black metal is quite big. Do you echo the sentiments already expressed, or do you have any other thoughts to express?
No, I think I agree with what has been articulated so far. I think, yes, they're basically different, like you said, different national spins on a relatively similar spirit. As far as quality goes, I think in my case at least, it's very unfair to even pose that question because, well, and this might be controversial, but in my opinion, the only really truly great band in the black metal style from Finland is Beherit, pretty much. There are other good ones, but I think that's the only one that I would put in the same category, or at least near the same category as the Norwegian greats, which are many. Like the very first ones, the highest the degree for me would be, of course, Burzum, maybe in the first place. After that, Emperor, I would say. Then there are many other contenders. I think all of those classic bands are very good in my opinion. Some more than others. I would also put in Slave near the top.
Honestly,
so Iljan is very
what do you think about
interesting.
Gorgoroth? Like when I revisit Gorgoroth, it's like, God damn, these guys are better than I thought they were. Like that, I remember they being like, Gorgoroth always surprises me when I revisit them. What do you think about them?
Gorgoroth.
Yeah, I would say those first three albums are almost a perfect articulation of kind of, it's really generic but really really high quality Norwegian black metal. It kind of bottles and distills like the essence of what Mayhem were grasping for at the time. I think, yeah, they're really
Yeah, I
top
agree.
tier.
Yeah, the first two Gorgoroth albums for me are extremely excellent quality. I might put them as slightly lesser than the best by Immortal and Emperor and Dark Throne and Burzum. But when I say slightly lesser, it's not to denigrate the quality of those two albums at all because they're truly excellent.
Yeah, they were definitely imitators and a tribute to the other bands to a certain degree because I think the originality is not exactly there the same way as it is with the other ones, but they were very very adept at it. And the fact of the matter is that they made two excellent black metal albums. I wouldn't put it up there necessarily on the same level as Dark Throne or Immortal or Mayhem or whatever, but it's pretty damn, it's pretty good. You know?
So
Yeah,
you like
exactly.
satanic music, right, Roman?
Sorry, you're gonna have to repeat that.
You like satanic music because Gorgoroth is very satanic.
Hey man, I love Gorgoroth.
Oh
Never
no,
cool.
you just touching on all the controversial subjects today, man.
Oh, that's okay.
I
Yeah,
mean,
no,
we
good
we can
music is
do the
good
topic
music.
later. We can do the topic later, but I feel that Christianity has no place in metal. Do you agree with that, Roman?
Considering that we're here talking about it and I'm on the podcast, I think I would disagree. But I think that that's a more extended topic for another episode.
Yeah, let's do it on the next one for the group chat. All right. Thank you for listening. And I want to thank everybody. Shelly, thank you for coming on.
Cheers, guys. Really enjoyed it.
Tyler, the wonderful Tyler.
Thank you very much for having me. I thought it was a very enlightening discussion.
Yes, sir. Roman.
Thanks, guys. This was great. There were a lot of great insights. Happy to be on here.
Yes, sir. And Raphael, always a great pleasure. And you all always welcome back.
Thank you for having me back, and this was very good.
Yes, sir. And thank you for listening today. I know it was all over the place, but we had fun. And that was kind of the goal of this, just to have some fun. So cheers.